Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm just delighted and great pleasure to introduce Jeff, who's actually local Vancouver person. But he is also, I would regard him as one of the foremost authority on Tibetan art and Tibetan Buddhism. And Jeff is known for the creation of Himalayan Art Resources website, and also translator of Tibetan texts. Since 1998, he has the chief curator of Himalayan Art Resource website, which features thousands of artworks from Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and Mongolia, which catalogs over 60,000 artworks. And all the texts in that website, the descriptions are all written by Jeff. And since 2007, there was also founding curator and scholar, resident scholar at the Rubin Museum in New York, which housed one of the largest collection of Himalayan and Tibetan art in North America. If you look at Jeff's biography, one of the most impressive, and I'm envious that he has received teachings from some of the foremost Tibetan lamas of 20th century, in Dezhung Rinpoche, who was living in Seattle, and he's if you have, there's a David Jackson written a biography of a lama from Seattle. That's a must-read book for anyone interested in how Buddhism came to North America. He is the teacher to all the Tibetologists that came in North America. And he also studied with the Sakya Trizin in Dehradun, and 16 the Gyalwa Karmapa, and Dezhung Rinpoche and Gyalwa Rinpoche, and in Vancouver with Sakya Trizin to show that. It's a fortunate and blessing that he has received from the foremost Tibetan teachers. And we're really happy that he's going to join us and talk about his studies of Tibetan art. Thank you.
Well, that's my idea when I first contacted Professor Sakya, with maybe that he would have some promising young students in a classroom and it would be more intimate. But this is what we have, so we'll work with it. Yes, I'm from Vancouver, and I don't know if all of you really realize that Vancouver was the center for Tibetan Buddhism during the 70s. And this is where people like Sakya Trizin, Gyalwa Rinpoche, Karmapa, even the Dalai Lama was here twice. But there were many, many teachers came here, and then many of the students that are many of them Vancouver people, some of course from Toronto moved to Vancouver, moved to Vancouver, and then they became quite fluent in Tibetan and studied, and then they went on to other places in North America and Europe to spread Tibetan culture and language and Buddhism. So Vancouver really was a very, very important place. My first Tibetan teacher in Vancouver back in maybe 1973, 74 was a fellow named Lobsang Lolungpa, who was also famous because he ran like Radio Free Tibet back in the 50s. And so we have Tibetans that live in Vancouver, and they knew that it was time to leave Tibet because Lobsang Lolungpa on the radio would say, the Dalai Lama is now safely in India. And then other Tibetans would say, oh, the Dalai Lama is in India, it's time for us also to leave. So there's a lot of famous Tibetans that have been here. And just at UBC, we had Leon Hurwitz. Now, he didn't do as much work in Tibetan, although he could read Tibetan. And he taught Tibetan studies. He was primarily Japanese Buddhism. We had Shotaro Ida, who was a famous student of Robinson from back in the 50s and 60s. So there was really quite a bit going on here. We had students such as Mark Tatz, who graduated from here. We had, goodness, I can't remember his first name, Hansen. We had a lot of people who did a lot of good MA and PhD work here. And then those books went on to be published. And a lot of people just don't realize that all of these people graduated from UBC and they did their manuscripts here that are then published by Shambhala or Tricycle or Thames and Hudson or some other publishers. So Vancouver has a very long history dealing with Tibetan studies and with Buddhism. Now, as for me, I've actually not lived here full time since the late 90s. There was a collector in New York named Don Rubin, and he loved not just Tibetan, he liked Himalayan art. And he thought it was very cathartic and very Freudian. He especially liked the wrathful imagery. He thought that it sort of spoke to his psyche somehow, being a communist capitalist Jew. He had a lot of angst about a lot of these issues. So he had a corporate office. So he had a corporate office and it had approximately 800 Tibetan paintings and Nepalese paintings hanging in the corporate office. The corporate office also housed about 900 staff. So, and this is right in New York, Fifth Avenue and 19th Street. So Don Rubin had many contacts with Tibetans in New York and different teachers and different centers and universities. And so they would have an endless parade of Tibetan lamas go through. And Don Rubin was never satisfied with his questions being answered, because if you have a Gyalpa teacher and you're showing him Tibetan paintings that are Nyingma or Bön, then that teacher doesn't know. And if you have a Bön teacher and you're showing paintings of Tara or Avalokiteshvara, then he or she doesn't know. So there's a lot of problems, because he also had the idea that he might want to start a museum with his paintings and sculpture, but he couldn't find anybody. So anyway, I was living here, and one of my hobbies was to always, since the early mid-70s, was always to ask different Tibetan teachers, who are these figures in the paintings? Or who are these figures represented by the sculpture? And I found that a lot of times people just didn't know. Or if they did know, it's because they had an intimate knowledge with that subject. Or they would say, oh, well, that painting is in my region style, and it belongs to this monastery. These figures all belong to this monastery. So then they would know. So it was a really long process to figure out how to even approach this subject as a hobby, just out of interest. But luckily, as I said, Vancouver was a hotspot. But Seattle was also a hotspot for Tibetan studies. In the early 60s, with the Rockefeller grant, then a number of Tibetans, Tibetan family was brought, and a number of other Tibetans were brought from India, and they were, some of them were extremely educated. So between Vancouver and between Seattle, there was a tremendous pool of knowledge and resources for learning about a little bit about art, but about iconography, narratives, and religious traditions. And that's the main real topic that you find with Tibetan painting. We'll talk about Tibetan painting. We don't have to worry about too much Mongolian or Bhutanese or Nepalese. It's Tibetan. Tibetan paintings will often just right away fall into a into a sectarian or a regional or a traditional grouping. It's like family portraits. You know your family. You don't know other people's family portraits. And so when you're looking at paintings or sculpture of people, then they fit into some family grouping, which we call lineages or traditions. Some people like to say that there's 4 main traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. They say Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, Gelug. But there's also others. There's many others. This is a super simplistic way of talking about Tibetan Buddhism. Nothing is actually ever really simple. It's quite complicated, and a lot of these things that you hear that are written actually may help initially, but they can in the long run cause confusion. And that's actually the title of my talk tonight. Is Appropriation, Conflation, and Abstraction. And I came up with this based on mostly frustration with new students, and especially Buddhist students, because I find that they are the most confused. And they're the most confused, I find, because they're the ones that think they know so much. They think they know what a Tonka is. They think they know what a Bodhisattva is. They think they know all this stuff that doesn't help at all for studying the art. It may be helpful for studying the Buddhist philosophy. It doesn't help with the art. The art is a different field than philosophy. Also, there's many different styles of painting and styles of creation of sculpture. And a lot of these styles are based on chronological period and then region. So if you're from Amdo, your sculpture is not going to be the same as somebody from Ngari in West Tibet. And it's not going to be the same as somebody from Central Tibet. And depending on what century you're in, things change. But art style is kind of a whole separate matter. And I don't actually have my head wrapped around it so much yet. It was never my interest, art styles, because that's a true art history kind of discipline and research avenue, this art styles. But what I have learned in the last 20 years is we haven't really even begun to create the theoretical approaches for studying the art from a modern point of view, from a Western point of view, or even a Chinese, Korean, Japanese, or Indian point of view. We're not there yet. We're not there. It's too, you know what? It's just too complicated. There's too many artists, and there's also too many good artists. And if you have too many good artists, and they're all from different regions, then your job is just much, much harder because you have to look at so much more material. It's not like Japan or China, like Shanghai area, China, where you're dealing more with very established genres of what is quality and what is not quality. Tibet is very different. So, but there's 3 things which I call the 3 daughters of Mara when it comes to studying Tibetan art. And that's appropriation, conflation, and abstraction. Now, some of these are meant more for Buddhist philosopher types who are very attached to their definitions of words, like what is a bodhisattva? What is a Buddha? If you're very attached to these things, then you're going to have a hard time with art. Because in art, we have our own definitions. They're not philosophy definitions. Philosophy is for the pecha. Philosophy is for the debate and the argumentation. Maybe if you're really good, then you might also become a practitioner. If you're really good, if you understand anything, then you become a practitioner. But appropriation is the first. Appropriation is something that comes up and people tend to argue over it, in funny ways. Like people say, no, Tibetan Buddhism is unique. It's all created by the Buddha, Vajradhara, or it's created by Padmasambhava, or its own Tsongkhapa did a twist on something. It's all ours. It's all Tibetan Buddhist. And it's like, no, it's not. Buddhists appropriate. They appropriate lots of things philosophically, and in terms of practice, we have something called what? The four immeasurables, or the four Brahma Viharas. They're called the Brahma Viharas because Buddhists didn't invent them. They were there already and Buddhists absorbed it. But when it comes to art primarily, the art that people are interested in is figurative. And it's either people or it's deities. And with deities, you have simple, you have sort of simple, then you have sort of a medium level complexity, and then you have very complex deities. Most deities in Tibetan Buddhism are appropriated. They're taken, now they're not taken from the Hindus, don't get me wrong here. They're taken from everybody. I mean, it's thought that Amitabha comes out of Zoroastrian, or it comes out of more Western Asian culture. Universal light, this whole Mithra kind of idea. But if we look at I have some images here, but I'm not sure how to move down the screen. We could take this figure here. If I can find it first. So here we have Ganapati. In Buddhism, we say Ganapati. If you're in India, you generally say Ganesh or Ganesha, but generally Ganesh. We don't say that. We say Ganapati. We say Ganapati because we don't have Ganesh written in our Sanskrit Buddhist literature. The Sanskrit text, the text in Sanskrit coming from India to Tibet, only say Ganapati. We don't use the word Ganesh. It's possible Ganesh is later. It's possible it became popular in maybe the 10th century or the 11th century or the 12th century. But in early Tibetan Buddhism of 8th, 9th, 10th century, it's Ganapati. All the texts have Ganapati. But Ganapati, everybody knows, is the son of Parvati. And then Shiva comes home, sees this strange boy in next to the bath of his wife Parvati, and so he lops the head off. And then Parvati got all upset and said, "You have to go out right now and get a new head for my baby boy." And so he said, "I'll go first thing I see or find, and I'll bring it back." So he found an elephant. So he took the head off the elephant and threw it on the boy. So this is coming out of Shaivism, Shiva. Well, Buddhism likes that. So Buddhism appropriated it. But we can't have a son of Shiva in Buddhism. That's just a little weird, because Shaivism and Tantric Buddhism are the most sort of at odds. Vaishnava Buddhists don't care about too much. They're all devotional. But the Shaivas are actually pretty clever, intellectual. So the Buddha story, there's many Buddhist stories, but in Buddhism, the stories generally say Avalokiteshvara, the great bodhisattva, saw that Ganapati was doing evil and sinful things. So Avalokiteshvara killed him and took on his form. So in Tibetan Buddhism, whenever you see a Ganapati, it's 9 times out of 10 or 10 out of 10, it's Avalokiteshvara. That's appropriation. Then we have another figure. And there's this is a complex deity. 8 bases, 16 arms, 4 legs. This deity is called Hevajra. Hevajra means hail to the Vajra. Hail to the Vajra. We've heard that before. That was quite popular in the 1930s and early 40s. A similar saying like that. But this is Hey Vajra, hail to the Vajra. Well, what is this Vajra? And who is this guy? Well, he's actually very much associated with war, weather. He's very amorous. And his main symbol is a Vajra. So what is this Vajra? Well, this Vajra has actually maybe 3 different kinds of origin tales from India, depending on what you're reading, the Vedas, the Puranas, or the Appropriations. Then you're going to get slightly different stories. But we don't care. We need to find what's the original story. Well, the original story is the Vajra comes out of the Vedas. And it was the symbol of a particular god. And that god was named Zau-Peter. Zau-Peter was one of the original gods from the Rig Veda. But we don't know him as Zau-Peter because I don't think we have many Sanskrit students here. We know him from his Latin name or his Greek name. Zau-Peter in Latin is Jew-Peter. In Greek, it's Zeus. Zau, Zeus. And of course, Peter just means father. So it's a father god. So this is where Hevajra comes from. Hevajra comes from Proto-Indo-European culture, then Vedic culture. Then with the development of Mahayana, we use this word Vajra to mean a number of different things in Sutrayana. In Sutrayana, we use it to mean the posture the Buddha sits in when he's under the Bodhi tree before he reaches enlightenment. That's the Vajra posture. We also say that the location where a Buddha reaches enlightenment, for all Buddhas, is Vajrasana. It's the Vajra seat or the Vajra location, which is Loka. And for a Buddha to reach complete enlightenment, he has to be meditating on Vajra Samadhi. And we can read about this in sutras like the Vajra Chedika, the Vajra Cutting Sutra. I don't like this translation of diamond. This is not a Western created problem. It's actually Chinese. The Chinese conflated Vajra and diamond back in something like the 3rd, 4th century. So, but I don't like it. I don't find it useful. If you think Vajra is diamond, you're just going to confuse yourself for years. So my point here, this is a very important deity in Tibetan Buddhism. In Vajra, it's based on the Vajra. It's modeled on the god Indra, who's modeled on Zau-Peter, who's related to Jupiter and Zeus. So this is appropriation. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's just what people do. You know, what was it? England invented the light bulb, then the US patented it, and then the US said, no, everything to do with light bulb is US. It's like, no, they appropriated it. Canada invented the telephone, US patented it. They said, no, it's ours, we invented it, everything's ours. No, it's just all appropriation. So we have many, many examples. Tara, who's a deity within Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, is also shared with Hinduism. It's shared with Shakta and Shaiva religion. It's possibly shared with the Jain religion as well. So there's many of these. There's Mahakala, wrathful deity. Mahakala is appropriated from the wrathful forms of Shiva. So we have a tremendous amount of appropriation by the Buddhists, but these other religions are also doing the same thing. If the Buddhists come up with a twist on something, then they appropriate it back. We have a deity called the Chinamasta, Virgin Pakamo Uchema, the severed-headed goddess, form of Vajrayogini, and that became very popular in the Shakta religion of India, and became one of the 10 Mahavidyas, one of the Dasha Mahavidya goddesses. So and not only did they borrow the form from Buddhism, which had adopted the form from Shaivism to begin with, and then modified it and then added Buddhist mantras, then the Shakta religion absorbed it into Shakta, and it took all the Buddhist mantras with it. So it's very easy to trace that it's coming right out of Buddhism. So appropriation is something that happens, nothing to be embarrassed about, and not something that we have to deny, because Buddhism itself, philosophically, has no gods. Even in Shravakayana or Theravadan Buddhism, yes, we have some gods. We have the 4 gods of the directions, who were the first people to go and make offerings to the Buddha when he became enlightened. They each offered a lapis lazuli begging bowl. And that was a bit awkward. What do you do with 4 begging bowls? So the Buddha merged them all into one begging bowl. So that's the begging bowl you see that the Buddha is holding. It was a gift from the 4 gods of the directions. These gods supposedly live on the 4 sides of Mount Meru of Indian cosmology. Then we have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and Indra, who are also regarded as worldly Indian gods. And those are absorbed and counted as being gods within foundational Buddhism, Shravakayana, Theravadan Buddhism. Then with Sutrayana Buddhism, Mahayana, we have slightly more gods. Agni, fire god, they're just different. They just incorporate a few more from the Indian cultural pantheon. So appropriation is something that happens. But in Tibetan Buddhism, you keep the Indian cultural gods, you keep them in their place as being within the realm of suffering, within impermanence and within samsara. These guys, they don't live there. These guys are actually just appropriated and made up as symbols. These are called in Tibetan yidam, in Sanskrit Ishtadevata, but Ishtadevata I think is a made up Sanskrit word. But these are made as part of a meditation practice to accelerate meditation. Because that's what Vajrayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism is all about on the Tantra level. It's about technique and practices that accelerate everything so that you can reach enlightenment quicker. So the Tantric theorists, the Mahasiddhas and the scholars, they came up with all kinds of different techniques, but they also liked all kinds of different deities that had all different metaphors. So this one, the metaphor is war. Some of you might have heard that the Dalai Lama likes to go around the world giving a big 2-3 day initiation called Kala Chakra. Okay, the metaphor for this is time. Everything is about time. Days of the week, months of the year, minutes in the day. Even the fingers are different colors and the knuckles are different colors on that deity as a mnemonic device so that you're incorporating all of your Buddhist philosophy, Abhidharma, Madhyamaka, everything into the meditation. So all of these have different metaphors. So these are not regarded as gods. We call them deities, but they're actually, what can we call them? Emanations of the Buddha. We can call them that. Or we could just say, it's just the Buddha appearing in this way. We could say that too. So anyway, appropriation. I'll leave it there. I'll go back. Okay, so. Okay, so appropriation is just something that exists. The reason I have difficulty with it is because I run into students who are very devout Buddhists, who say, no, we never took anything from other people, it's all ours. And so the whole purpose of this is like, no, we borrow a lot. Now, conflation, this is another faith-based problem. Conflation is a technique used by different Buddhist groups in Tibet. And what they do is they try and make everything easy and digestible. So my best example comes from the Nyingmas. My second best examples come from the Gyalpas. But the Nyingmas, what they like to do is they like to say, all of these appropriated deities are actually all the same. And so if we have a female deity, the most important tantric female deity in Nyingma is called Samantabhadri, Kuntuzangmo. Kuntuzangmo. So that's in the tantra side. But then on the sutra side, it's Prajnaparamita. But they're the same person, it's just one is tantric, one is sutra. And then the meditation form is Vajrayogini. And then the protector form is Ekajati. And then the human form is Yeshe Tsogyal, the wife of Padmasambhava. And then the later human form is Machitlabdra. So then what the Nyingmas are doing is they're just putting all female deities and humans as being the same person to make it easy for practitioners. The problem here is you can't come into an art history class or studying Tibetan art and think that that's this faith-based idea is how the world works, because that's just nonsense. That's faith-based. You have to separate faith-based from art history. Art history is an attempt to find the historical origins of things and the whys. Why did things change? What happened? So we're not saying faith-based is bad. We're saying it's at odds with studying history, because Prajnaparamita and Samantabhadri and Ekajati and Vajrayogini did not all grow up together. They're not the same person. They all have different histories coming out of different books at different times from different regions in India and Tibet. And that's just a fact. And the lamas will tell you that. They may not tell you that in a large group, but they'll tell you that one-on-one. So you have to be able to distinguish this whole notion of conflation, which is a faith-based notion. What I do find is different traditions, they tend to use it more for female deities, not for male. So I think there's a little misogyny in there. But we also have it with, we can find it with male figures, whereas in the Gyalpa system, you have the one-faced, six-armed form of Mahakala called Gompo Chakrupa, which is six-armed Mahakala, Shadbhuja. This comes out of a tantra called the Mahakala 8-chapter tantra. In that tantra, the interlocutor with the Buddha is a deity called Hayagriva. And this Hayagriva and the Buddha are talking about needing some form of Mahakala that's powerful for whatever reason, but then saying, Well, in this case, I'm going to teach a Mahakala with one face and 6 arms, who is an emanation of Avalokiteshvara. So that's conflation, but that's conflation coming out of a text, a recognized text, but it's still conflation. Problem is, though, is with most and many Gelupas, is then they'll say all Mahakalas are Avalokiteshvara. And then, but they're not. Only that one is. Maybe you might find a few others that are Nyingma revealed treasure, Terma. So this is another form of conflation that goes too far. You're taking one example from one book and applying it to every example that exists in art or in literature. Conflation. We have a lot of paintings of teachers who are famous. Karmapa, Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama. We have a lot of paintings, a lot of sculpture. But then what happens is, if you look at who all the previous incarnations are, then they start to intertwine, interweave. And then you find that, oh, well, in the Karma Kagyu, you have Situ Panchen and the Situs, Thai Situs. They were, previous incarnation was Marpa, the founder of the Kagyu, Dokpo Kagyu, Marpa Kagyu. But then you have the Gelugpa Longdo Lama, who also was a Marpa in the previous life. Then you got 2 or 3 others. And then in Tibet, you have like maybe 12 incarnation lineages where they claim descent from Milarepa. They were all Milarepa. So then you have, in the 18th century, you have Katok Sewang Norbu goes to Jonang, Takten Punsuku, and he brings different books back. He got along very well with the government of Tibet. It was a sealed library. And then the Situ Panchen and his students, they really like the writings from this monastery, and they see that, oh, there's a famous Lama named Taranatha. Oh, well, let's just make our Lama also an incarnation of Taranatha. But there's all these other people that are incarnations of Taranatha already. So eventually you get to the position where all of these good teachers and good students teaching each other, they're all the same person. That's conflation. And you have to be careful of that, because the system was never intended to be like that. The system was intended to be small and narrow and enclosed. It wasn't intended to be public. You know, it's a very private thing. You know, it's like in your own family. You might say, well, you know, decades ago, 100 years ago, we were a very good family, very bright people, and we were rich. Maybe you weren't. But you have things, but it's not intended for outside the family. You have things you say about your family that might be inside. So that's a form of conflation that's also a problem for students. It's also political. It's also a big political deal. Because if you have the Panchen Lama and you have the Dalai Lama and you have the Desi Sangye Gyatso, and what they do is they pick all of the most important teachers in Tibet going back 500-600 years. Well, then basically you've claimed everything. You state the claim that the Panchen, the Desi, and the Dalai Lama have ownership over everything. Because if they were the Marpa, and they were the Sakya Pandita, and they were the Sachin Kumirinpo, and they were all the most important Nyingma leaders, well then you don't need anybody else. These guys are it. So it's also political who is chosen to be the pre-incarnations. That's conflation. So we need to be aware of conflation. Also, there's disputes. So you just need to be aware of it. Okay, we're going to move on. This is a very small picture of Tara, but just before I move on. Tara has 21 different forms. You may not have heard. coming out of a famous tantric praise, 21 verses to the 21 Taras. And in religious practice, in religious lineage, we have at least 5 different traditions of the 21. And they don't look the same. They all look different. They come from different parts of India and Kashmir, and also from Tibet. We have at least one, maybe Jigme Lingpa, maybe Longchen Nintik, and then Chogyur Lingpa came up with their own 21 based on previous systems. But from India, we have at least 3, 4 different systems of 21. Okay, fine. But some of the Tibetan traditions, what they do with these 21, they all have their names coming out of India. But then what the Tibetans do was Tibetans will put another deity's name with it. Like they'll say Marichi Tara, Kurukula Tara, Siddhatapatra Tara. So they'll take all the most popular female deities of Tibet, coming from India, of course, and then make them all Taras as well. That's conflation. Because we don't have that in the early literature. We have some little bit of conflation in the Tara Mulakalpa Tantra, where some deities who are thought to be independent are also said to be Tara, but we also don't know whether or not those names are just being applied as an epithet, as a title for Tara. Like she's like Marichi. She has the light of Marichi. So it's a little sketchy as to what is the real meaning there. It's always weird using somebody else's computer, just not sure how much pressure, what to touch. Okay. Now, abstraction is a little bit more, it's a little bit more difficult. I've not worked out how to best approach it, but it is one of my big problems when dealing with new students. And one of the things, going back to the term Chongchup Sempa, Bodhisattva, it's very common for people to look at a peaceful deity and they say, well, that must be a bodhisattva. And they look at a wrathful deity and they say, well, that's a protector. This is all some kind of abstraction on the student's part, trying to fit these terms that they know, or thinking that, you know, there's some, maybe an easy formula. So it's not the case. Tara is actually not really a bodhisattva. Yes, you will find occasional instances where she is referred to as a bodhisattva in some tantric literature, but then she's then referred to as something else, or a goddess, a deity, or a Buddha. So you can't take it seriously that they're referring to her as a bodhisattva, because in Buddhism, bodhisattva is like, well, the bodhisattvas we care about are like being a university professor. To be a university professor and have that title professor, you have to have some credential and you've got to be paid. These are the two things. So Tara is not a bodhisattva. Tara, you don't even find in sutra literature. Tara is a product of Vajrayana Buddhism, and primarily a product of two main people. One is called Atisha from India. The other one is called Surya Gupta, sometimes known as Ravi Gupta from Kashmir. These are the two main people who promoted Tara in Tibet. Ravi Gupta didn't go to Tibet. His students promoted it in Tibet, primarily through the Sakya tradition. Then Atisha came from India, and then he promoted Tara. But within a tantric context, not within a Sutrayana context, we don't have sutras where there's Maitreya and Kshitigarbha and Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri and then Tara sitting there asking questions. We just don't have that. Tara is a product of Tantra. So calling her a bodhisattva is actually inappropriate. And it's the same, you have to make a distinction between deities that are in Vajrayana and deities of the same name in Sutrayana. Fine, we have Manjushri is one of the main interlocutors with the Buddha in sutra literature. Yes, but how does he relate to Manjushri in Vajrayana Buddhism? In Vajrayana Buddhism, Manjushri is a fully enlightened Buddha already. That's how his status is understood. And he primarily functions as a yidam, as a Ishtadevata, as a meditational deity. He is no longer a bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is a technical term which has a definition. So Manjushri, as found in sutra literature, has a definition as to what his status is and what his role is. Manjushri, Vajrapani, Avalokiteshvara in Tantric Buddhism, in Vajrayana Buddhism, has a different definition. In Vajrayana Buddhism, we can have Manjushri, one face, two arms, orange in color, holding a sword, or he can be red with one face, two arms, and wrathful, embracing a consort, or he can have 36 arms and wrathful and a buffalo head. So who is this guy? It doesn't sound like a bodhisattva. So really the problem here is people not distinguishing between the idea of bodhisattva and what is peaceful appearance in art. In philosophy, we talk about Buddha as being all kinds of things. In art, Buddha only has one meaning. A guy with a bump on the top of his head, long ears, an urna, a dot on his forehead, 3 lines under his neck, possibly webbed fingers all the same length. So this is Buddha. It's an appearance. So when we're dealing with art, most important is what are we seeing, not what are we thinking. That's my problem with Buddhist students studying art, is they don't want to see. They want to tell you what a bodhisattva is. And now Tara is a bodhisattva. Look how beautiful she is. She's like a bodhisattva. Or maybe she's a dakini. That's the other thing they'll come up with. She's just like a dakini. Not that any of us know what a dakini is, because in Tibetan Buddhism, we don't have any one clear definition. We have a range of about 6 different things, from complete Buddhahood to a witch or a ghost and ugly. So this is the range for dakini. So this is some of the issues. Many protectors are not wrathful. Even the word tonka, most of you should be aware of the word, familiar with the word tonka. Okay, well, I don't use it actually on the HAR website because people generally use it incorrectly. Tonka is simply a scroll work. It's not a painting necessarily. It can be a textile, it can be a drawing, it can be a painting, but its real main characteristic is it's rolled up. So if you have a painting on the wall, a mural, it's not a tonka. It's a scroll work. It has to be rolled. And it's not necessarily a painting. Now, I just find that this is a very confused word because people want to use it. Because young students often want to use as much jargon language as possible because then they sound intelligent. But it doesn't always work that way. I have a big problem, and other people have a big problem in mainland China. Mainland China, the government puts a lot of money into art schools, and they want to make the word tonka to mean Buddhist spiritual art. But it's not. It just means scroll work. And what about the Bumbos? What about the Bun religion? I mean, are we going to take the word Tonka away from them? So, we have to be more aware of definitions and meanings and how we use jargon words. I do find Bodhisattva a lot more offensive than Tonka, though. Just because it's just so misused. So sometimes people will say to you, if you're looking at a Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist painting, everything has meaning. Even the blue color of the sky has meaning. The green tree has meaning. And you know what? No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. There are so many different styles over the last 1,000 years in Tibet. It's very hard to keep up with all the good ones. They're just not, there's not enough hours in a day to document all the good art. And no, not all people, they didn't always make everything with meaning. Sometimes they just put things in that they liked. We were talking earlier today about one of my favorite subjects is a monastery in East Tibet called the Triap Monastery. And people have different reasons for liking Triap Monastery. My reason is because there was an artist named Kazi Lasso. And he came out of Chamdo in the late 18th century. And he worked, he even went to China, worked in Lhasa for a bit. His main teacher, who he painted for out of Chamdo, passed away. So then he decided he wasn't going to be a monk anymore. And so he moved back to his area, which was the Chamdo, but then south of Chamdo was this area called Triap, and there's one big Gelugpa monastery there. And there's a village called Kazi. And then he became the Lasso, the artist for Kazi village. I can't remember his name, because I'm not sure if his name is truly the artist or it's his brother who was also an artist. So we're still researching this. Anyway, this guy is one of the greatest recent artists of Tibet. His main work was roughly 1800 to 1820, just amazing. But what he loved to do, he put pairs of animals. If he's going to do a partridge, he's got to have two, male and a female partridge. If he's going to do tigers, then he has to do two. But he also had a signature. And his signature was a white tiger. Now, so if he puts in two small little baby tigers, and one's going to be white, one's going to be orange. Now, the other thing he would do is if he's painting a wrathful deity, well, you can't put in cute little animals into wrathful deity paintings. It just doesn't kind of work. So let's just say it's a wrathful deity. Then what he would do is he would put a white tiger skin on them that they're wearing, which nobody else in Tibet did. Because everyone knows tigers are generally orange or yellow, not white. That's more like Cirque du Soleil or Vegas or something. So this guy had his own little signatures. All the good artists had their own signatures. They put in things, and other artists would know. Also, artists would put in jokes. One of my favorite jokes, I don't have it here, is a painting in the Rubin Museum where it's a tree, but part of the tree, it's all gnarly, it is a camel's face looking right down on you. And until you point it out to people, nobody recognizes it. But once you see it, that's all you see. It's just a camel's face looking down on this teacher. So there's tremendous character amongst the best artists. Also, they have tremendous freedom to do what they want. And there's an old wives' tale that all Tibetan artists train for years and years and years and have to do the retreat prior to making a painting of a tantric deity. Not true. None of this is true. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. If you are a practitioner of, let's say, Kala Chakra here, and you want to do serious practice, then within the Tantra, the Sanskrit text translated into Tibetan, it says oh, you want to do serious practice, maybe do a retreat, 3 months, 6 months? Oh, well, you have to make a painting first. So the painting comes before the practice. You don't do the retreat on something and then paint it. You paint it, then you do it. Of course, this fell out of fashion about 700-800 years ago. And people generally pay some money and they get an artist to make the painting for them for doing serious practice, which is why monasteries developed their own schools, and then lay people were itinerant painters and traveled around the country doing paintings and sculpture, because people weren't capable of doing it themselves anymore. So, is this shocking to anybody? Am I being too forward about this? No? No. Okay, what's the time? Let's do questions. Questions?
I have a question. Buddhist practitioners and I would guess artists traveled from Tibet and spent time in India studying and then coming back to Tibet. Is that not right?
Early on, yes, that's true.
Early on,
Early
yeah.
on, not in recent,
Right.
recent centuries. No.
Right, back during the time of Ashoka or some periods like that, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know the history. But
yes,
I recall that. And so would the artists that went to India bring back, appropriate, like you said, things that you can document during that time when they were in India, they came back with a certain style of art, or is that?
Absolutely. Actually, the earliest style in Tibet, well, there's actually a royal style from like the 8th, 9th century, but that's primarily stone and wood. We don't have examples of painting. But what we do have is we have lots of palm leaf manuscripts with illuminations, all in Indian style. So when it comes to painting, we say that the first style in Tibet is Indian style.
Okay.
Then we have Kashmir style, Nepal style, and then the true Tibetan styles. There's some arguing, because some people are more Indiophiles and some people are more Tibetophiles. And so most people will say for sure the 15th century is the true Tibetan styles, with Gyalwa Monastery and then the Kinri and the Menri style of art, named after two famous artists who worked at this monastery called Gyalwa. But I say it's actually before that. I say it's 14th century and really coming out of places like Shalu Monastery. And Gyalwa Monastery, which is famous in the 15th century for developing so many styles, they are a branch monastery of Shalu. So it's all natural flow. Yeah.
I'll ask you one question, just totally out of nowhere, but it's important to me. The murals of Alchi, where are they situated? Is that Kashmiri? What is that art form of those particular ones that, you know what
Yeah, I do, but you know what? It's just not my area. But I would say it is very much influenced by Kashmir.
Okay.
And Rinchen Zangpo, they're actually after Rinchen Zangpo, so that's 11th century. But yeah, it's all West Tibet. So so first of all, it's West Tibet. So what's it influenced by? Kashmir.
Thank you very much.
And it's interesting, if you look at some of it, and you don't look at the main deity figures or Buddhas or Tara or anything. You look at all the small decorative figures and motifs without the Buddhas, then you think, well, what the hell? Is this Turkey? Is this Persia? Is this Mediterranean? You know, because it's like there's so many figures.
The design quality of the.
Wait a minute. We don't have any of this in India.
No.
Where is this coming from? Oh, it's horsemen from the steppes of Russia. Or it's Persia, yes.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting art. And some of the very best. And West Tibet has some of the best examples still existing today. Yes.
I just have like a tiny clarification question. Is conflation like kind of too many cases of appropriation, or are they more separate?
They overlap.
Okay.
They overlap. Conflation is once, yeah, okay, you can say, if you have too much appropriation, then conflation will take over. Yeah. And then we even have it in late times. We have it with Lelung Shepe Dorje. Lelung Shepe Dorje, he tries to say that all Mahakalas and all protectors are Avalokiteshvara. If you read his what's it called, the Tenzin Jutsu. So I don't rely on that book too much. The same as I don't rely on the Pema Katang for the history of Padmasambhava. That would be a little too much. Padmasambhava is a person who is said to have brought Buddhism to Tibet. And conveniently, many people leave out Trisum Detsen and Chandarashi. But Padmasambhava is this, it's a quasi-historical figure. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, somebody came up with an apocryphal biography called the Pema Katang, the Lotus Annals of the life of Padmasambhava. And then they also associate all kinds of quasi-Indian mystical yogis, such as people like Virupa and Dombi Haruka. One is teacher, one is student. But in the Pema Katang, they say, oh no, those are all emanations of Padmasambhava. Well, what the teacher is an emanation of Padmasambhava, and the teacher's main student is also an emanation of Padmasambhava. Well, what's the point of that? You know, what's the function? And where are the people who are trying to study Buddhism? If everyone's an emanation, where are the actual Buddhist practitioners? So conflation is a faith-based phenomenon to try and make the history and some of the practices easier to understand. But it can also go the other way and just confuse the hell out of it. Question? Yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, I have a question about this sort of your frustration that you uttered about this difference between a faith-based approach to images that doesn't really work in your opinion, I think, as opposed to a more art historical or historical approach. And I was wondering whether one could also think about a difference between like what is in the scriptures as opposed to what is in the artistic practice. That not everything that we find in images we can understand by studying text.
If you want to be very faith-based, then you don't study history in the first place, let alone get to art history. You don't do that. And your whole motivation is different. And so it's fine. You know what? Another frustration I have with faith-based people, sorry if you're faith-based out there, is if I show you a really beautiful painting of Padmasambhava, like done by a master artist, and I show you an ugly painting of Padmasambhava done by a school kid in a monastery, the faith-based will say, oh my God, they're both beautiful. There's no discernment because they're only seeing with the eyes of devotion. So it doesn't matter if it's an ugly Padmasambhava or beautiful, they're equal. So faith-based is something a little to the side for me, because that's not my job. My job is to do something that other people haven't really done, and that's to promote Tibetan art. And they didn't do it in 1959. They didn't do it in 60. They didn't do it in 1965 in Dharamsala. If you're from Amdo, I let you slide because you have a different attitude. But refugees in Tibet, in India, they decided to go with Westerners giving advice that Tibetans should call all of their art handicraft. And this is like a death knell for art. Because in the Chinese language, Han art is fine art, minorities art is all just handicraft. It's a put down. So for decades and decades, in Dharamsala, they call their art handicraft. Well, no fine art museum in the world is going to be putting handicraft on display. I mean, I didn't make it up. It's just the way it is. Tibetan art is not handicraft. Tibetan art is fine art. Tibetan art is very important. How we measure great cultures and societies in the world, we measure by a certain set of standards. Language, laws, music, architecture, art. This is how we judge Egypt, how we judge Greece, Rome, the Mayan Empire, the Incas, India, Japan. Tibet has been making fine art for over 1,000 years. And it's in every major museum in the world. But it does not get the appreciation it should get. And part of that is Tibetan's fault. It's Tibetans saying, well, we have very nice handicraft. Yeah, well, too bad. It's not going anywhere if it's handicraft. People in Amdo, they're a bit different. Amdo are very proud people. Literature is one thing, but also their art, they promote. And in mainland China, Amdo people, Chensa, Rebkong, all these areas are the most successful with art. But there's no faith based attached to it. It's all economics, it's all money. And huge amounts of money from Chinese government, which is partially destroying the art. I also have issues with just different lamas. If you show a lama a nice painting, you say, Rinpoche, what do you think about this? And they look at it and they say, no, everything's impermanent. Have a good heart. We're talking about culture now. We're not talking about lojong or mind training. So art has been overlooked, and Tibetan art especially, Nepalese, Mongolian to a degree, not Bhutan. Bhutan has been a closed country for so long. They keep most of their art inside. But the art has been owned by wealthy collectors, art dealers, and museums. And so it's been very difficult for scholars and students to access the art because it is being treated as fine art by Westerners and some people in Taiwan, some people in Japan, some people in South Korea, but not by Tibetans. And it's not easy to access it if you're a student and you want to study the art. Because in the West and in Europe, they keep it all locked up. You can't touch it. If you do touch it, you have to be wearing rubber gloves or cotton gloves. It's just so difficult to study. Not all of this art, yes, not all of it is fine art. Some of it is damaged art, but historically important because it may have a letter on the back by the 5th Dalai Lama. I found a painting in auction one time. It's going back to about 2005. It was at Christie's auction house in New York, and I desperately wanted to buy it. I didn't have the money, and I couldn't convince my boss at the time to buy it with museum money. So I couldn't buy it. I have to go through channels. I don't have a pot of gold. Now, this was a very beautiful painting done in an old Menri style, but it was a very beautiful painting, but it was gold. So it's a little bit difficult to see. So if it's in a museum setting, it's not going to have the impact that other art might have. But this painting on the back had a very long inscription. And it talked about how this painting was made and why. And it was for a Mongolian prince who had passed away. And this painting had been commissioned along with many other paintings. And then he talked about the two main styles of art in Tibet. One is called the Menri, which is a sun-like style of art, and one is called the Kinri, the moon-like style. And then he went on to say, and this painting is done in the pure Menri style by such and such an artist. And it went on and on and on. Anyway, I never got the painting, but I was pleased because a museum in Germany, where they had a curator who knew Tibetan, saw it and said, oh, this is historically important, and bought it. So it has a good home, but this is a rare story. There's so many paintings that are so historically important, or paintings that are artistically important. They're the Rembrandts and the Michelangelos of Tibet that are languishing in the basements of museums or in the homes of private collectors that only see dollar signs. This is a problem. But calling good Tibetan painting and good Tibetan sculpture, calling it handicraft, is a travesty. Questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that not all things in art have meaning. Like sometimes we are too eager to assign meaning to it. So I was just wondering, when you look at a piece of like a brand new piece of art you've never seen, how do you go about interpreting it?
Well, it depends what it is. If it's a chart or if it's a figure, is it a human figure? Is it a deity? Then for me, I'm just kind of rudimentary. So I'm just looking at what kind of style and what period is it? Like where roughly is it from? Is it worth looking at? You know, some art is not worth looking at. You know, I mean, come on. You know, every airport in Asia, every airport in mainland China has a Tibetan shop where they sell Buddhist stuff, and most of it is complete junk. And I'm sorry to say a lot of it is actually from Amdo, from Reptong and Chensa. But Lhasa doesn't do that. Lhasa buys their junk from Kathmandu and then they sell it in the stores.
Well, I was thinking about appropriation and conflation. And can we use the same approach to consider appropriation and conflation from more indigenous Tibetan roots or shamanistic roots, those as elements that have been, well, incorporated, appropriated, conflated with in order to create this art?
We don't have a lot of shamanistic art. Very, very rare. You get shamanistic art on the more the southern slopes of Nepal or in Bhutan. But we don't so much in Tibet.
Are there elements that you could see that I see
Elements?
this aspect, I see that they've incorporated, it's been incorporated. I think of Vajras, for example, I don't know that much, but I have seen in Nepalese shamanism, the dojes.
Oh, yeah, they use all of that. They especially use the purba.
Yeah.
They use all of that. Sure. I mean, the ritual objects. Yeah,
Just wondering.
they use all of that. I don't think about it that much because I don't have examples to look at. I don't usually deal with, I don't usually deal so much with ritual art or shamanistic type. There's other people who are very good at this in Europe where they've been doing it for a couple of hundred years.
I consider about
Americans
Western
are not
art,
good
right?
at this.
Yeah, think of Western art, how it's been Christian art has been overlaid on previous traditions in terms of, you see it in terms of the calendar and imageries and certain personages and saints, etc. So I wonder if that all comes up. I'm just thinking.
Well, Tibet, I think I've done 2-3 videos on YouTube where I talk about what has Buddhism taken from the indigenous cultures of Tibet.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's based on it's based on an exhibition and a publication that was done in 2007. Something Carmen, if you've heard that name before. And if you haven't, then you should know it, because he's one of the great scholars.
So
Bunpo, he's Bun religion,
what is this?
Samten Karme, Samten.
Yes.
The Karme has two different spellings, but I think he goes mostly Karmay. And he's based out of basically Paris now. But we did a Bun exhibition, first ever in the Western world, in New York. And so I didn't know anything about it. I didn't learn. And what was interesting about it was Buddhists, if they really don't recognize something, Buddhists just say, oh, it's Bun. It's like the disposal, it's whatever. Anyway, but I had to learn it because I found that in the Rubin Museum collection, they had so many paintings. I think it was over 100 paintings and some sculpture were actually Bun, and I didn't know anything about it. As a matter of fact, I was raised in Vancouver to believe that Bun was dead. But, you know, Padmasambhava took care of them a long time ago. There were some remnants, and Milarepa dealt with them too. Like, it's really a kind of terrible thing. Like, Buddhists can be really awful. So then I realized, because I remember in India, even back in 74, 75, I remember asking, are there any Bumpos still around? And everyone said, oh no, there's no Bumpos, not allowed, no. And then I found out later that there's a place called Dolanji, which was like a 3-hour drive from where I was. And they had, you know, hundreds and hundreds of Bun monks and village people and schools, elementary school, high school. Yeah. So, but there are lots of things that the Tibetans still have that they call Buddhist that are not, they're Bun. Fancy hats is a Bun, but this also can be small b, not necessarily capital B, Bun religion. It can be just Tibetan culture. Fancy hats, smoke offering, juniper, smoke offering, torma, the very fancy butter torma cakes, small Bun. A dance is Bun. It's very possible that the cult of Sri Devi in Tibetan Buddhism is primarily influenced by Bun, because the cult of Sri Devi in Buddhist India was very small. But once it hit Tibet, and then it mixed with a deity called Sipe Jalmo, the main protector goddess of the Bun, who had dances and songs and music. Music is all Bun. Thread cross. You get all the color threads. They look like American Southern. What do they call these thread crosses? Dream catchers. The katak. Now I know the Dalai Lama likes to say the katak goes back to an ancient Indian tradition of offering respect, but we have no evidence for that. What we have evidence for is that the katak is related to something called the mutak. And the mutak is a more of a heavier wool scarf, and it's still used in Bun marriage ceremonies as an offering. Buddhists don't have a marriage ceremony. Buddhists don't believe in marriage. Don't believe in mixing Buddhism with marriage. So there's no ceremony. Bun have a marriage ceremony. The mutak goes back to early Tibetan culture, origin culture, where the first people to live in Tibet came down from the sky, and they had a tether or a cord called a mutak, and they came down to the mountaintops. In Buddhism, all the mountains and lakes are evil, and they have to be subjugated by Padmasambhava. Every lake, every mountain. The mountain is male, lake is female. But to the Bun, they came down to the mountaintops on the mutak, and they called the mountain uncle, and they called the lake auntie. But the Buddhists didn't like any of that, so they said it's all wrong, all evil. Padmasambhava has to subjugate it all. And Tibet is a land of demons. But the Bun have a whole different idea. So the mutak and the katak are related. There's many, many, many things. Question? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Here you're concerned about the role of collectors and dealers, Western museums, and how often Tibetan material is inaccessible because it's in storage. But I think the situation is changing, and so it's a bit more nuanced than presented. And here I'm thinking about the recent call for repatriation of objects. And here I could just use an example from Nepal. There's been quite a lot of photo documentation of objects from temples that have been stolen. They show up in a museum in Cleveland or in Texas. And so there are efforts to repatriate them to Nepal. But now when we look at the situation in Tibet, the numbers of monasteries and temples that have been destroyed, how could that be a possibility in the current political climate? And I'm thinking about the founding of the Tibet House, and the Dalai Lama himself talked about how these objects were in keeping until the time that they could return to Tibet, right? So I'm just, you know, as I say, I've visited museums, you know, and I think even the practices in museums are changing in that the PMA, art museums in Chicago are exhibiting Tibetan art much more regularly, right?
And that was the role of Himalayan Art Resources 26 years ago, was to get the art out of the basements and show it, and also to volunteer our assistants in documenting their collections. I spent a week at the Field Museum some 12 years ago with a student going through it to see what was there and what can be promoted, what's historically important. Yes, no, things are changing. Things are changing, but I mean, I don't mean to be totally doom and gloom. I'm just trying to shake people up because this is something that's been, it's almost like Tibetans and Buddhists don't take ownership of their own art and culture. And that reminds me of a story of the Japanese prime minister, and this is going back like 35, 40 years now. They had an exhibition in San Francisco, and the Asian Art Museum had to be the old one at the Golden Gate Park, can't be the new one downtown. And the Japanese prime minister, and it wasn't a huge exhibition. And then the Japanese prime minister comes, they said, oh, well, thank you so much for coming. You know, we didn't know it was going to be such a big deal. He says, it's Japanese art. It's our culture, we own this. Of course we're going to be here. You don't get this with Tibetans. They don't do it. But you know who does do it? Mongolians. Mongolians are very different. They're very, very strong-minded. But Tibetans don't for some reason. And it needs to be shaken up a bit because they have the majority of the art. It's not Mongolia, it's not Bhutan. It's not really China. The best art, Tibetan art in China is all just gifts created by the Qianlong or the Yumla or Kangxi emperors. The best art is in Tibet. Best artists are the Tibetan artists, not sculpture. Sculpture remains with the Nepalese, the Newars and the Shakyas. They're the best. As a matter of fact, some scholars believe that Tibetans made very little sculpture, and it was all just Nepalese working and moving around in Tibet for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we know that from documentation from all the monasteries. Yeah. Question.
What about Ajanta Ellora and how that fits in the sculpture there? That I had I was there in 1971 and I was just awestruck by the beauty and the incredible carving into the face of a mountain. All those caves.
Hundreds of years earlier than the Tibetan material. Yeah, but they have paintings, and you know, the paintings on the walls, the ones that are still remain, and also at Pagan in Burma, then those, Myanmar, those paintings, you can see relationship with the Tibetan paintings. Yeah.
I was wondering, yeah. Because your description of the Bodhisattva brings up an image of a carved face of a Bodhisattva with the long elongated ears, the helmet, you know, and it's such beauty, radiant beauty was coming out of this face that was carved into the mountain, out of the mountain. Just amazing. I don't know if that has had any influence at any point.
But going back to my point, yeah, in India, they own their art.
They what?
They own their art.
Uh-huh,
They own it 100%.
right.
They take tremendous pride in their art.
Yeah.
They will advertise their art. They will show
Yeah.
off their art.
Yeah.
Tibetans don't.
Mhm.
Don't know why. And you know, I've not found a lot of really good teachers. My best teachers are all from Seattle and Vancouver. And they were great teachers because they knew iconography. They knew texts.
Mhm.
Dezhung Rinpoche in Seattle, he knew art. Dilgo Khyentse knew art. Triap Rinpoche, he's the best at iconography. Right now, he's the best in the world, I think, at iconography. Triap Rinpoche. Very best. He's in Bonn, Germany. There is hope. There's hope because there are so many good students in Tibet and in Amdo and in Kham right now. My very best student is in Amdo. He teaches at the Qinghai University. And he teaches Tibetan art history. He doesn't teach painting. He doesn't know how to hold a brush. He doesn't know the iconometric measurements and the tiksa. He just knows theory. And he's a hope. Then there's another fellow who's actually from Rebkong, outside of Rebkong, who lives in Chengdu now. And to me, he's the best Tibetan art historian in the world. Like when I go, you may know him, Gendan Dampa. Gendan Dampa, he's just the best. But he's also an artist. He was a monk, artist, but then he became a researcher. He's the best research scholar for Tibetan styles and artists and different things. And iconography is excellent. So, I mean, when I'm in Chengdu, he doesn't speak any English. So we just spend the whole time just sitting in restaurants or at his home, just talking about art in Tibetan. And I don't speak Tibetan, really. So we just talk all the time about art. We have very good people. We have some in Lhasa who are really excellent. I have a young student and she's working at the Potala for a few years before I try and push her to get a PhD. And she studied at SOAS with Christian. A lot of young Tibetans, if they can get out of China, mainland China, they go to SOAS, which is really good. And then they go back and they have all different skills. And then they mix those skills with wherever they went to school, Beijing, or where they went to Sichuan, Dashui, Sichuan University, where they have a big Tibetan institute. I teach at Sichuan University. That's my home university. So, and the majority of students are Tibetan students.
Yeah. What is the process of making behind these like Tibetan paintings? Like, do they also do these like little thumbnail sketches like we do these days, or like how do they plan it out or like start the making process?
Some do, but not usually. Usually it's just based on the iconometric measurements and then following standard models. There's only 3 standard models that a painter learns. Buddha, seated Buddha, then like Avalokiteshvara, and then Tara. So then you have a Buddha. No, and Vajrapani is thrown in as well. Wrathful Vajrapani, you gotta have a wrathful. So maybe it's 4 models. But from the Buddha, then you can make bodhisattvas. From Tara, you can make any female deity, multiple faces, doesn't matter. From Vajrapani, you can make anything wrathful. You can make Vajrapani. But there's a big emphasis on tiksa, and there's many, I mentioned my favorite It's not my favorite, he's my best student. But, the Tiksa, his PhD was Tiksa. And I thought that was horrible. Just because it's just so boring, because the best artists don't use Tiksa. The best artists will do one line. And then they know what to do because they're a master artist. They don't have to do all kinds of measurements for the fingers and this. They just freehand. Everything's freehand. You see, those are master artists. In China, there's a strong emphasis on Tiksa. And it's a problem. And in India, there's a strong emphasis on Tiksa as well. Who was it? Just passed away, Tempera. The professor at Lhasa University. Tempera.
Yes, I posted in social media. I forget. Yes, Tempera.
Tempera. He was old. I haven't been in Tibet for 3 years, but anyway, I see him with him and he's old. But, you know, he was old past his time. They were just wheeling him out. But he was their representation of the past. And he believed everything was Tiksa. Even master students have to use the most meticulous measurements. And you may not know this name, but there's a fellow and his wife, David and Janice Jackson. And they did a book on, they did the best book there is in the English language on Tibetan Tonka painting and how to do the ground, how to make the pigments, the brushes, everything. Okay. So David and Janice, they were doing research. I was with them in 1975 in North India, doing research on Tonka painting. And they wanted to commission a painting that was completely done absolutely correctly according to all of the tiksa, all of the iconometric measurements and lines. So they had this painting done and it was god awful. It had no inspiration to it. It had no movement. There was no flow. Because everything was based on measurements. Because if you look at the best, some of the best paintings Tibetans have produced would be the Khyentse styles of the 15th century, little before and after. And if you have a deity with 16 arms in the Khyentse style, every hand is different. Every hand, like Indian dance. Everything is different. You can't do that with Tiksa. Tiksa is something, it's like a disease that's taken over. It is identical to when I was a child. We learned in kindergarten to write, to make 3 lines. You make 3 horizontal lines. And in the bottom 2 lines, you do an A letter. And then to make a capital A, you use all the lines right up to the top. That's Tiksa. But once you know how to do the alphabet, you don't use iconometric measurements for writing. But in Tibet and India, they want to use Tiksa always because they say there's a book. This is a problem. There's a book and it calls itself a sutra. It's not, it's a commentary. It calls itself a sutra. So a lot of people in Rebkong and Amdo region, they rely on this Tiksa book because it's called a sutra, meaning the Buddha spoke it and said you have to use Tiksa all the time. But it's not a sutra. It's in the Tengu. It's not a sutra. So they're following this idea, even as adults, when they don't need the training wheels on their bicycle anymore. They're still painting with the training wheels. So that's a problem. But there's tremendously great artists in China, in Nepal, and in India who will just overcome these things because they realize they're silly and these guys are just good artists. Now, by the way, for the women out there, women can be great artists as well, but generally in Tibetan culture, the women stop painting once they get married because the women are also looking after all the finances. So there are great women artists. They're just few and far between, but there was no prohibition. It's not like India. You know, in India, you never taught painting or art to girls in the family. Did anyone hear of that before? Because you always marry the girl off. And you can't be giving all your art secrets to another family. So in India, the cultural tradition is you don't teach the girls anything. In Tibet, girls, boys, doesn't matter. It's just whoever. And I knew a number of girl artists who later got married and gave it up. Yes.
Most of the art that we've seen, or at least I've seen, most of the stuff you've talked about has been like characters that are very personified.
Figurative art, yes.
Yeah. Is there much art that's more abstract? Sort of just more representational with less of a character as the piece, but like something maybe like mandalas, which are kind of just like representing something without it's like an actual person or deity as the main piece.
We would have to say mostly it would be something like mandalas, but within art, within a figurative piece, then you have you can have abstract sections. Very abstract. Maybe I can pull one up. There's one painting that is really quite exceptional because of the, when you look at it, you think it doesn't quite belong to the time period. This painting here, this is a painting of Milarepa, and it's out of his biography. There's a story. There's a hunter down here and a deer and whatnot, but it's very difficult to see here. But the abstraction is all up here with some figures, but also with the landscape. Now there is also an element of borrowing from Chinese Yonglo blue-green. From the time period. You see, these figures are very abstract, and the landscape is very abstract. So there are elements like this, but real Tibetan abstract painting didn't come along until like the last 30, 40, 50 years.
Is there any sculpture that's like less specifically, obviously, a figure?
There might be. I'm not familiar with it. I mean, my background is Buddhism, so I'm not, and I'm not an art historian. And yes, I went here. I took some courses here. I took some Sanskrit. There's a professor named Jeffrey Hopkins. He was here in 83, 84, and I was here for a year with him. And I think I gave my first seminar here in like 1981, a 3-hour seminar on iconography. But I never graduated from here. And I'm not an art historian. Everything I know about art history, I've had to kind of learn because I used to recommend different people to look at different sources for the art history. I mean here, styles, painting styles, sculpture styles, period, chronology, things like that. And then I found that a lot of these books are just not very good. So I've had to spend a lot of time looking at art history, even though I generally kind of consider it a little boring. I consider myself a text-based iconographer. I'm text-based. I'm Tibetan and Sanskrit texts, and I'm interested in the iconography. Where does it come from? What does it mean? Is it dead? Is it still practiced? One of the important things about Tibetan art and Himalayan art is it's a living tradition. That's one of the most important things about it. It's an absolute living tradition, which is strong and it's moving forward. So that's interesting, especially when there's so few iconographers and so few people who are actually studying the art. Yes.
Qualified some artists being good and some as being not so good. And I'm curious if you could maybe flesh out what measure you're using. You say
There's no such thing as that old wives' tale, oh, art is subjective. That's just garbage. That's like saying, I'm gonna book a flight to Ottawa, and you know what? Pilots are subjective. And the quality of mechanic is subjective. And it's not. Your appreciation of art is completely subjective. But art is not subjective. Art is as technical as some Amdo poet who's famous, like Lama Kyap in Oxford. I mean, it's technical, it's got meaning, it's got depth. Paintings and sculpture, there's good, there's mediocre, and there's really awful. And the world is full of mostly awful. But what's good, though, is we don't really see that. It's the good stuff is what rises up. And that's what really separates everyone else from being a master artist. This is a master artist painting. This is from a set. I identified these 15 years ago. This one lives in Chicago now. Used to live in England. Then there's one that's that Don Rubin bought in the mid-90s. Then there's another one in a museum in Munich. And then there's one that I discovered in a museum in Australia that was a gift of an Australian ambassador to like Sikkim 100 years ago. And they gave him like a painting and then he gave it to a museum in Australia. It belongs to this set. And so this set is a set of the Karma Kagyu lineage, but specifically of the Karma Gun monastery, the monastery of the Thai Situkas from Polpum, but Karma Gun then. And so this is before Thai Situ moved to Polpum. So this is a great set. And each of these paintings now belongs to a greater whole. And these museums where they thought they had like one painting stands alone, no. What most people still don't understand is half or more of all Tibetan painting is made in sets. They're not single paintings. There are sets of lineage teachers, or sets of incarnation teachers. There are sets of the life story of Tsongkhapa, the life story of the Buddha, the life story of who knows who, or there are sets of mandalas from a Sanskrit text that has 42 mandalas that are deemed the most important. So they do a set of 42 mandalas. That's of all art, is sets. And putting those sets back together is one of the main things that we do on Himalayan Art Resources website. Yes.
So you have a set of criteria.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say that's a subjective call. On your, like, you know, you value those things. You value the information density, the technical prowess, the historical, you know, relevance.
Yes. And it's based on Tibetan standards. Yes. Now, some things are based on Mongolian, other things are based on Bhutanese. You know, Mongolians will say, no, we don't do it like that. That's Tibetan. We do it this way. Or West Tibet will do something different than East Tibet. Yeah, so the criteria will also depend on region and time period and style. Yes. But there has to be a certain level of skill.
For sure.
Yeah.
What was this one called again?
Well, this is a
Or just the
Milarepa.
search up there on the site.
The figure is called Milarepa, and it's in the Milarepa Masterworks. Yeah, some years ago, we decided we had too much art to work with, so we started just trying to deal with masterworks for every subject. You know, people, deities, style, region, what are the masterworks? And we don't compare one region or style to another. We measure it only within its own space. Stop. Yeah. One last question? Yeah.
So as you have mentioned that, you know, one of the deficits of students studying art is that those students actually cannot see the art, and many art pieces are hidden behind the exhibition. And many art pieces are in the Western Museum instead of Tibet, right? I'm just wondering, like, do you think that those Western museums should give back those art pieces that belongs to Tibet for them to study better? Or do you think like it's better to keep it in the West?
No, it has to stay where it is for the most part. The Tibetan paintings, Nepalese paintings are very much a commodity. And they're gift items, they're bought and sold. So we can't take that away. There's a big issue with a lot of, there's a website, I don't know where the website is, but it's on Instagram. It's Stolen Art of Nepal. And there's a lot of trouble with this because some pieces are truly stolen and then there's police reports. Others are stolen because they're architectural elements and somebody sawed them off a wooden temple. But then others are small sculpture and painting, which are freely bought and sold or given as gifts. Also in Nepal, we didn't have a bunch of white people running around Kathmandu Valley in the 50s, 60s, and 70s stealing stuff. Because they actually put a stop to that quite early because they found that Americans were a little bit light-fingered. And so they said, no Westerners can go into a lot of the temples anymore. But the majority of objects that are stolen by the locals. That's a problem. But then you have Indians and Europeans and North Americans who are then setting up a consortium and telling the locals what they should steal next. So that's a problem too. So there's lots of issues with this. Also, some of the people who are saying that these objects were stolen, or some of them are the ones who sold it in the first place, and they got into trouble with their family and they're trying to save face. I think we're not going to run into this problem with China, because China, up until really up to about 20 years ago, China was selling Tibetan art out of military-run storefronts in Hong Kong. So the Chinese government was selling Tibetan stuff to get foreign currency. So it's not as easy for China to claim repatriation of certain objects. And they don't care about the Tibetan. Tibetans minorities. They only care about really Han material. So anyway, it's a very difficult subject. And a lot of Tibetans, they sold a lot of their own material because they needed to eat, you know, in Kathmandu and India in the 60s. So.
If you want to follow Jeff, you can follow him on Instagram and YouTube. So he does wonderful short commentaries and book reviews and commentaries on things. I mean, I think it is Jeff Watson on Instagram and Himalayan Art Resorts on YouTube. So you can see the video. It's a very short videos every day, not every day,
Every 2-3 days.
yeah, that's really wonderful, to follow him on that. So let me thank Jeff for his generous.
They just ran out.
You know, it took